Hey there guys, Nordic Warrior here, how's it going? So yeah, this is going to be another spur of the moment type of video where I just basically talk about whatever's been on my mind. You guys know the deal at this point. I just randomly get the urge to make a video from time to time and I just start recording and see where it goes. So yeah, make yourselves comfortable, this is going to be another one of them. It's going to be a bit of a different video today though, because I'm going to be talking about Islam. Now, Islam is something that I've talked about quite a bit on live streams because it's something that often gets brought up as a topic of discussion when discussing politics and religion and things of that nature. But it's something that I've never dedicated a whole video to because up until very recently, I've never really felt the need to. Now, as you guys that have been following my live streams will know, I'm quite well versed in Islam. It's something I understand better than most people, particularly better than most Muslims, which is quite surprising when you think about it. But Islam is something that I grew up around. Okay, I grew up in the most multicultural city in Europe, or at least it was at the time that I was growing up. And I grew up around a lot of Muslims. I knew a lot of Muslims. I boxed with Muslims. I trained with Muslims. I studied with Muslims. Like, I've grown up around a lot of them over the years. And it was something that from a very young age always kind of fascinated me. And I always kind of took it upon myself to educate myself about it. And yeah, it's just one of them things that, like I say, I understand it better than most. And one of the things that I've alluded to in live streams about Islam is how, personally, despite it technically being a religion, I don't really consider it a religion. What I consider Islam is I consider it essentially a oppressive ideology or worldview, essentially a tool of war. That's essentially what Islam is. Because if you look at the very inception of Islam, ever since its inception in the 7th century, it has essentially been a scourge on society. And I'm not really scared of saying that openly because, if truth be told, it's gotten to the point where I feel like political correctness in regards to subjects like this is basically just suppressing the truth, suppressing justice, and making light and trivializing issues that really shouldn't be trivialized. And nowhere is this more important, in my opinion, than Islam. And at the point in time we're at now, Islam has gotten to the point where it's essentially infiltrated every single aspect of infrastructure across Western civilization. We're seeing Muslim mayors and Muslim MPs implemented all over the world. There are segregated Muslim communities being set up everywhere. They're taking over a lot of corporations. They're taking over a lot of aspects of media all across the West. And Sharia law, which is something that in my country used to be laughed at. Whenever people like the EDL, for example, when I was a kid, used to go out and talk about fighting back against Sharia law and Islamic doctrines becoming mainstream and becoming enforced by law, people used to get laughed at and called a racist or an Islamophobe for bringing those things up. But if you look all across social media, you'll see that Sharia law and Islamic doctrines are actually being implemented all over the world now, and it's not just the Middle East. It's actually infecting parts of Europe, parts of the Americas. If you look at Canada, for example, there's a lot of Islamic indoctrination in Canada. In the UK, and I've talked about this time and time again on live streams, the United Kingdom, the prison system over here is actually being used as a recruiting ground for Islamic extremism, and the terror threat is currently listed as substantial. So essentially, Islam has integrated itself into the United Kingdom and essentially made it a police state. Right now, the way that the government is set up here, just criticizing Islam can get you thrown in prison. Like, it literally can, and not even just criticizing it, just pointing out various aspects of Islamic culture and Islamic scripture, quoting something from the Quran can actually get you sent to prison in this country. I'm not joking, even though it's literally in the Quran. That can actually get you sent to prison because it's deemed causing division and in fueling community tensions. They've got some like BS new law that they came out that they're able to arrest people for. But yeah, literally quoting the Quran and highlighting various aspects of it, it can actually get you banned from the country. There's a popular YouTuber named David Wood who attended Speaker's Corner. If you guys know what Speaker's Corner is, it's essentially an open space for debate. It's a park somewhere in London. People go there and they give speeches and they have debates and things of that nature. David Wood went there and said Muhammad was a pedophile, which he was, by the way, and it actually got him banned from the country. He's actually banned from entering the UK now. So he was due to do some sort of event over here. He'd bought plane tickets and everything, and he got turned away at the airport. He wasn't allowed in the country because he said that. And if he did manage to get here, he would be thrown in prison without a trial, essentially. So it cannot be denied anymore that Islam is becoming a bit of a monolithic entity in society. And I want to do maybe some content highlighting that. I'm not going to fixate on Islam because I don't think that's wise, because there are other issues and there are other problems and popular topics going on in the world that need to be looked at. But Islam is one particular topic that a lot of people on the reactionary right seem to conveniently avoid talking about, particularly a lot of the, and I did mention this briefly in my previous schizo rant that I went on, particularly a lot of the quote-unquote groiper types, that have got a problem with the Jews in Israel. And look, I agree with a lot of what those people say, but they seem to pretend that Islam doesn't exist. They seem to act like Islam is inconsequential, which is just simply not true. Again, there are Islamic mayors and MPs being elected all over the West right now, implementing aspects of Islamic law, which will eventually and inevitably lead to Sharia law. Okay, and if you look at across the Middle East, with what happened in Afghanistan with the troops being pulled, and of course what's happening all across the UAE and whatnot, there's a lot of Christian churches being burnt down, people being beheaded, people being exterminated, ethnically cleansed, and Islam has well and truly violently subjugated a lot of parts of that region. And you have to wonder whether or not it's possible that an entity such as the Ottoman Empire could actually be reformed with how much of a foothold the Islamic world has right now in the Middle East, and how it's slowly but surely infiltrating the West from within. And let's not forget that if you look at the history of states such as Iran and how those nations got to where they are, there's always been this strange uneasy alliance between Islam and communism, which could probably be a topic of its own video, how Islam and communism have kind of teamed up over the years. But yeah, I digress. What did I want to talk about? So this isn't actually going to be about all that, and about how Islam from its inception has always been a cancer on society, a scourge on society. It's not even, this video is not even going to be about that. What I wanted to talk about in this video is one of the most controversial hadiths involving Islam. And when I say controversial, I'm not talking about, it's offensive or, people get triggered by it or anything like that. That is true, but that's not why I call it controversial. The reason I call it controversial is because this particular hadith is one that is widely interpreted different ways. There's essentially two different interpretations of it. You have the interpretation that pious Islamic scholars describe it as, and then you have basically everything else, everybody else's interpretation of it. Those are the two different interpretations of that particular hadith, and it's not particularly homogeneous. Now, before I go any further, I feel like I need to explain what is a hadith. Now, a hadith is essentially Islam's most trusted sources, right? So you have the Quran, which is essentially their version of the Bible, which is essentially a corrupted and bastardized version of the Gospel and the Torah, which also plagiarizes numerous aspects of pagan literature and pagan teachings and things of that nature. I will talk about that in great detail in future videos, but that's not going to be the purpose of this. So that's the Quran, right? That's the essentially their version of the Word of God, right? Not the real God, not the triune God of the Holy Bible. It's actually the word of Hubal, also known as Baal, also known as, you guessed it, Satan, but we'll get to that. that's a whole different rabbit hole. I digress. The hadiths are essentially Islam's trusted sources. So essentially, Islamic scholars over the history, the followers of Muhammad, the descendants of Muhammad, his relatives, his closest, most trusted followers and advisors and whatnot, passed down from the history of generations of Islam. Essentially, that's what the hadiths are. Okay, so they're not straight from the Quran, but they're Islam's most trusted sources, and they're often cited by and quoted by Islamic scholars when they're teaching Islam and when they're engaging in dawah, which essentially is their version of evangelism, which is a word that actually means deception. That tells you, or it should tell you, anything you need to know about Islam. It's literally, I mean, have you heard the saying, Satan is the father of lies and deceit? Have you heard that saying? Well, again, I digress. Let's stick to the topic at hand. But yeah, this particular hadith that I wanted to talk about is about the story of Al-Zut, or more specifically, Muhammad and his meeting with the men of Al-Zut. Now, chances are, if you don't follow any of the online criticisms of Islam, if you don't follow the likes of David Wood and the Apostate Prophet, and a lot of the sort of slap fighting that goes on in that community, because a lot of people in the Christian truther community won't talk about Islam very often, but you'll find that guys like that do, as well as guys like Raymond Ibrahim and Christian Prince and all these different ex-Muslims, guys who speak Arabic and whatnot, who translated certain aspects of the Quran and translated many hadiths and basically presented them to the English-speaking world and put a lot of this into the light, essentially. What you'll find is that they take a lot of these hadiths and they, like I said, they translate them for English speakers and they do their best to interpret them as accurately as possible. And for this, they often get accused of Islamophobia, right? Because they're often accused of taking these hadiths and corrupting them or misinterpreting them deliberately to paint Islam in a bad light, as if you really need to try to do that. But really, all they do is take the Islamic scriptures, take the hadiths and whatnot, and just translate them into English. And when you actually read and understand them, and bear in mind, some of these people actually are native Arab speakers, right? They speak Arabic. So when you hear these guys tell you that the English translation of these hadiths are actually accurate, they are actually what they sound like, it's pretty shocking, but it's also pretty funny in kind of a dark sense of humor kind of way. So if you've never heard of the story of Muhammad and the men of Al-Zut, I'll give to you the two popular interpretations of it. So the Islamic interpretation of it, if you were to ask, say, like a Dawah or an Imam about the story of Al-Zut, this is what they'll tell you, right? They'll tell you that Muhammad and his follower went into the desert in the middle of the night, that Muhammad drew a line in the sand and told his follower, do not cross this line or you will die. He went into the desert, spoke to these men who were large, aggressive, strong, dark-skinned men from Pakistan and areas around that region. And essentially, he sat down with them, cited Islamic scripture to them, and after several hours of arguing with these guys and debating them back and forth, the charisma of Muhammad and the prophecies he foretold to these people and how convincing he was and how well spoken he was and things of that nature managed to make them all come round and they all converted to Islam. So Muhammad came out of the desert absolutely exhausted from this horrific debate with these big dark-skinned Pakistani immigrants, essentially. And eventually, it took a lot out of Muhammad to do this, essentially. That's what the Islamic scholars will tell you, right? He sat in the desert with these guys in the middle of the night and did everything he could to convert them to Islam. And by the grace of Allah, he was able to do it, right? And then he went home. Now, that's their interpretation of it. That's what they'll tell you that those verses mean. Now, the interpretation that secular scholars have, so any atheist scholar, any Christian scholar, any Jewish scholar, basically anybody who reads that particular hadith, who isn't a pious, ideologically possessed Muslim, who essentially worships the Prophet Muhammad, how they view that story is that essentially Muhammad was looking for a particular source of manliness, right? He was looking for some way to essentially increase his sexual vitality. And what he did was he went into the desert, he drew a cook line and told his follower, do not cross this line or you will be killed, right? Went into the desert and had a gangbang with 30 men. Because if you read the hadith and translate it accurately, what it actually says, and it's it explicitly states this, and it's very, very clear in regards to this. It states that Muhammad went into the desert and was ridden by all these men, by the men of Al-Zut, and that he was ridden so hard that he came back essentially all messed up, all bruised up, in a bad state. The men of Al-Zut in the Islamic scriptures are described as having large penises, as being very, very dark-skinned, and as being essentially sexual dynamos, right? They're known for their sexual vitality. That's what these men were known for. They were just extremely horny all the time and just wanted to bang anything that moved, right? Including goats and including allegedly the Prophet Muhammad, right? So essentially what happened is Muhammad went out in the desert, had a homosexual orgy with 30 men, and returned home, and this gave him the strength of 30 men, right? This gave him the sexual energy to have intercourse with 9 wives on the same day and take only 1 bath. Again, this and that comes straight from the Quran, right? Essentially, that's the story of Al-Zut, told from a secular, Jewish, Christian, anything but Muslim perspective. And what's quite interesting about it, and I've been looking into this quite a bit recently, I used to believe that homosexuality was something that didn't really exist in ancient times, obviously because it's something you don't really hear about aside from like the modern day sexual revolution. So you think of like the 1960s and the Civil Rights Act, and essentially when family values and more specifically Christianity in Western civilization was starting to decline, and basically the satanic elite started to put certain ideas out there, started to mess with the water supply, the food supply, and started to basically sexualize everything in the media. And you kind of had this idea, if you're somebody like me, who saw that and kind of comes to the conclusion that homosexuality came about as a result of that, kind of like what we see with porn, putting ideas out there like bestiality and just all the kind of sick things people are into nowadays. You get the sense that they were indoctrinated and chemically imbalanced into thinking those sorts of thoughts, and that it's some sort of chemically and psychologically induced mental illness. But what you'll actually find if you study history and archaeology of pagan culture is you'll find that isn't actually the case. And in a lot of pagan societies, sexual relations, I just got a text, I'll read that in a sec. But yeah, sexual relations between men, middle-aged men and young boys was often a pagan ritual, particularly across the Middle East. In fact, I think it was only really prominent in the Middle East. But yeah, essentially, if you look at a lot of these old-style pagan societies across the Middle East and, of course, certain parts of Africa, they believed that an adult man basically forcing himself onto a young boy would increase their sexual vigor or their sexual vitality. In fact, there are actually certain parts of Africa today that still believe this and still believe things like that. Like, for example, there are certain tribes in Africa that believe that having sex with a newborn baby will cure AIDS. Like, they actually believe that. That's something that you don't get taught about in history class, of course, or in geography, but it's widely practiced today. It still goes on, and again, in a lot of pagan cultures, they would do things with goats, things I'm not gonna discuss here. But My point is, sexual relations between adult men and young boys, or very, very large men and very small men, were often induced in those cultures, and they were often artificially promoted. So when you consider the origins of Islam, it came around in the 7th century, how it essentially hijacked paganism. If you look at, for example, there's a particular Islamic tradition today where Muslims from all around the world will gather in a place called Mecca, right? And there's a giant stone called the Kaaba, and they walk in a big circle around this stone, they kiss the stone, they do all this weird ritual stuff. That's actually straight from paganism. Now, the people of Mecca were pagans who worshipped a deity known as Hubal. Right, that I mentioned that earlier. Hubal was the name of a deity that they worshipped, and Hubal is actually derived from Baal, who was a deity worshipped by pagans in the Holy Bible. And bear in mind, the gospel came around many, many generations before the Quran and before the coming of Muhammad in the 7th century. But Baal was widely worshipped throughout the Middle East. And Baal, as those of you who study the Bible will know, is widely believed to be just another name for Satan, right? So essentially that stone was about devil worship. It was about paganism. Now, Satan is essentially everything that Christ isn't. He's the complete opposite. He's everything perverted. He's everything degenerate. He's everything sinful. You know, he enters the hearts and minds of the workers of iniquity. So in retrospect, it doesn't surprise me that in cultures that didn't have Christ, you know, cultures that were consumed by demonic paganism, and again, atheists that are listening to this are not going to believe a word I'm saying. So, but essentially, if you don't believe this stuff, if you don't believe in the spiritual realm, you don't believe in demons, you don't believe in Satan, you don't believe in God, this is going to be lost on you. My point is, if you understand that stuff and you understand how evil Satan is, essentially, how he is a fallen angel who enters into your mind and your heart using frequencies to make you do bad things, to make you sin, then it doesn't surprise me that pagan societies of the day engaged in forced homosexuality, and that homosexuality was seen as something benevolent, right? It was seen as something that would give you power and give you strength and things of that nature. So the idea that Muhammad, who essentially was a pagan, right? He was considered kind of a demigod to a lot of Muslims and still is to this day. The idea that he would go out his way to engage in a homosexual act with 30 men in the middle of the desert in some sort of ritual that he believes will give him sexual power, it's not different, or it's not that much different to what a lot of people believe today, or at least within the past 100 years or so. Because if you look at, like, for example, the Church of Satan, the likes of Antoine LaVey, the likes of Aleister Crowley, you know, these famous Satanists, what it is they believed was they believed in a concept called sex magic, right? They believed that by having sex with children or little boys and giving them diseases and even doing things with animals and whatnot, as well as performing in perverse, you know, anti-Christian, anti-conservative sex acts, they believed that these things, like I say, would give them power, that it would give them vitality, that it would make them superhuman in a sense. So it doesn't surprise me that when you see how Muhammad is viewed in the Islamic world, again, he's considered so important and so consequential that you can't even draw a picture of him. That will get you stoned to death. Like, if you live in an Islamic country, drawing a picture of Muhammad will literally get you executed. It will. That's how much of a demigod this guy is considered to be in Islam. Right? They worship him more than they do Allah, right? Which is crazy to think about. But it doesn't surprise me, the idea that Muhammad would engage himself in a pagan ritual involving sex magic. Because again, if you read the English translation of the Arabic hadith, you'll see it clearly states that Muhammad was rode, that these people rode on him. Alright, now what does riding on a person mean? Did he give them a piggyback or something like that? And again, there's a lot of damage control that's done by Islamic scholars where they'll talk about, for example, they'll say things like, oh, riding means you're riding his ideas and it's metaphorical, and you're riding the wave of joy and euphoria when he converts you to Islam and things like that. Like you'll see them have these conversations with AI. Like they'll manipulate ChatGPT to give them an answer that they're more comfortable with and things like that. Because that kind of helps them cope with finding out that Muhammad was not only a pedophile who married a 6-year-old girl and raped her when she was a prepubescent 9-year-old to consummate his marriage with her, and that he also had sex slaves and that he had 9 different wives. Again, he had sex with them all in the same day, only taking 1 bath. This is, of course, sometime after having a gangbang, allegedly, with 30 men in the desert, Al-Zut. It's interesting to me how the Islamic world constantly does damage control for this man. They constantly act as if this man is someone to look up to, and not only that, they call him the greatest man ever, the most influential man ever, the absolute the quintessential role model for society. That's literally what Muslims believe. And it's crazy to me, man. It's just crazy to think about. So I thought I'd talk about this because, the story of Muhammad and Al-Zut, I feel like it harkens to a lot of what's going on in the world right now. If you look at, again, I talked about this really, really strange, uneasy alliance between communism and Islam and how the two have actually helped each other throughout the history and they've helped each other violently subjugate and entirely take over certain nations. Again, the perfect example of this would be the history of Iran. Like, Iran is a fascinating country, by the way, if you look into its history. I'd encourage reading some of that. And it's also fascinating to me how it confirms, like, what's going on with Islam right now. It confirms the demonic influence that paganism always had on society, even from the days of Genesis. So if you look at biblical teachings around paganism, right? Paganism was responsible for slavery. It was responsible for usury. It was responsible for essentially, the concept of sin being implemented as an institution in society. That all came from paganism. It all came from the worship of the likes of Moloch and Baal. And even to this day, you've got the Bohemian Grove and all these different societies, the Skull and Bone Society and whatnot. All these secret societies, all these factions within the satanic elite, they all come together and they worship idols. Okay, Islam, the entire Islamic world comes together and worships a giant stone that essentially contained ancient lore of Baal worship. It's crazy, man. It's fascinating. And I really think people need to start looking into Islam a little bit more, because one of the biggest problems that Islam faces is the internet. Because what the internet does is it allows for a plethora of information, such as the hadiths being translated to English and things of that nature, which help to educate a lot of people on what Islam is like and what it's all about. Very, very useful. I recommend it very much. I recommend educating yourself on Islam, on its history, its culture, and let me know if you want me to do more content on it. I know there's guys out there like David Wood, again, Raymond Ibrahim and the Apostate Prophet and guys like that, Christian Prince, guys who speak Arabic. I don't speak Arabic, but guys who are more well versed on Islamic scripture than I am, because I don't actually read the Quran. Like, the information I get from Islam is from talking to Muslims, growing up around them, doing my own independent online research into various hadiths and quotes from the Quran, and just the history of Muhammad himself, where he came from, what he was all about, certain aspects of him that people don't seem to know. Like, for example, people across the Islamic world don't seem to know that Muhammad was a white man, that he was a white man with red hair, according to their scriptures. They don't seem to realize that he died from being poisoned by a Jewish woman, right? I mean, again, I hear talk of Muslims and Jews living in harmony in certain parts of the world. That's if you read what the Quran says about Jews and what it says about Christians, it's just not possible. It's not. Okay, it's moderate Islam is the snake in the grass. Oh, sorry, moderate Islam is the grass, and radical Islam, is the snake that's in the grass. That's what I heard somebody say one time, and it makes perfect sense. But yeah, the story of Al-Zut and Muhammad's weird sex life is very, very reminiscent of the Church of Satan and the modern day satanic elite and their opinions and their ideas about sex and sex magic and things of that nature. So yeah, this has been a rambling video. Who knows if I'll even upload it. Quite interesting, don't you think? So yeah, and yeah, look, we just got, New York just got its own version of Sadiq Khan, so that should be fun. We'll see what happens there. We'll see. We'll see what happens with the crime rate in New York. I'm expecting casual sex assaults and things like that to go up. There's just this weird thing about Islam and sex, isn't it? It seems to turn people into sexual demons, doesn't it? Like sexual deviants. Like, yeah, it's fascinating. I've maybe said enough. I'm busy. I've got things to do. So yeah, interesting topic. Let me know what you guys think anyway. Thanks for watching and God bless.